Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. The title of this video sounds a bit weird. It is, do you need to be an electronics engineer in order to be a musician? I know it's a very stupid question, but it's actually a serious question. It's a question that I am asking myself at this moment in time. Now, I mean, if you happen to be lucky enough to own a piece of vintage gear, a vintage synthesizer or a keyboard, for example, then it really does help if you're an electronics engineer. You know, vintage gear tends to go wrong. They tend to have faults, they need maintenance, they need recalibrating. It really does help if you know what you're doing. It really does help if you happen to own a soldering iron and own a multimeter. And if you're not an electronics engineer, then I think it really is helpful if you know one. If you know an electronics engineer who can help you out. I did a video about vintage gear, a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek video about vintage gear a little while ago. I touched on that whole subject. I'm not going to talk about it now. But what if you don't own vintage gear, but you own recreations of vintage gear? Then do you need to be an electronics engineer in order to be a musician? That is the question that I really want to ask in this video. And I'm talking about modular, and I'm talking about eurorack. You can see behind me here I've got this lovely collection of eurorack modules. Specifically at the moment I'm trying to do a video on the Behringer System 55 modules here. And it's at this point that I'm asking myself, do I need to be an electronics engineer in order to use these modules? I think it's it's an important topic. It's an important topic that we should be aware of, because for me, what Behringer are doing with eurorack is they are bringing to the man in the street recreations of modules that we would never otherwise be able to have or own or think about owning because of the cost, because of the maintenance, etc. Right? So here we have almost everyone is able to get their hands on a recreation of a Moog System 55 module, and that's a fantastic thing, but it comes at a price, and that price is maintainability. It's the need to calibrate modules, and that's really what I want to concentrate and talk about in this video. And it's not specifically angled at Behringer modules, although Behringer are very much in the spotlight because they are providing us with these recreations of vintage circuits. But actually, if you look at any eurorack modular gear that is based on physical analog circuits, so I'm talking about an analog module like this as opposed to a digital module like this one. Let's hold it around the right way so you can see it. Right, this one doesn't need calibrating. It's never going to need any maintenance at all. This one does. And that's what I really want to talk about in this video in kind of general terms. I'm not going to be going into the specifics of the System 55. This is not a review of the System 55. It's just I'm trying to do a review of the System 55. And I think that asking the question about do you need to be an electronics engineer to be a musician is probably quite pertinent when it comes down to eurorack gear, analog gear, and the need to recalibrate them. So what is this calibration that I'm talking about? Why is it needed to be done, and will you ever need to do it yourself? That's the big question. Well, we're not talking about every module that's in your eurorack case. We're talking about just a few. We're talking about the modules that actually generate tones. So we're talking about oscillators fundamentally, but we're also talking about filters. If your filter can self-resonate and then you want to track its pitch across your keyboard and play it like an oscillator, then you're going to need to have some calibration going on with your filter as well. So we're talking about primarily oscillators, but also filters. So what is this calibration about? Well, I'm not an expert, I'm not an electronics engineer, so please forgive me if I get any of this wrong, and please help me out in the comments if you can back me up with some details here. But what we're doing here is we've got what's called 1 volt per octave. That is the eurorack standard. So we give a voltage to this particular module, and in return it plays at a certain pitch, at a certain frequency. And to make sure that it's playing at exactly the right frequency, no matter what voltage we give it, requires some calibration. It's something that just can't happen by just putting some components together. You need to actually make sure that the components are working correctly. And you'll see on the back here, there's a whole bunch of different trim pots, I believe they're called, where we can actually calibrate this module. We've got these 3 ones down here, but we've also got 4 up this side, 3 up this side, and there's actually another one somewhere. Yeah, inside there's another one. There are all these little points where with a little screwdriver we can adjust this module so that it gives us accurate tuning. So whatever we play on a keyboard or using a sequencer or whatever, we will hear. And the biggest factor in terms of tuning with one of these modules is the scaling. So even if we haven't calibrated it at all, I could play an A4 on my keyboard, and because I've got a manual tune control here on the front, I could, using a tuner, make sure that it's perfectly in tune with that note that I've just played. The issue then comes down to, well, what if I play any other notes? Will it stay in tune? So A4 might be in tune, but A5 won't, and A6 will be even worse. There is a scaling issue here that has to be set up correctly on your oscillator. Now, you would hope that when you buy your oscillator module, that it has been calibrated for you already. And generally speaking, that is the case. Now, how accurately it has been calibrated is a different question altogether. Now, with my System 55 modules, in my case, they're behind me, I actually bought the whole lot secondhand. I bought it off of eBay. I bought it off of a guy who had collected all those modules, put them in the case, got to the point of having to calibrate the modules, and I think pretty much gave up at that point. So I ended up buying these modules used. And so if you buy eurorack modules used, you might well have a situation where someone else has attempted to calibrate them already. You just never know. If you're buying them brand new, then you're hoping that the manufacturer has calibrated them accurately for you. So what I've got there is a case pretty much with a load of modules in it that I bought used that aren't particularly well calibrated, I have to say. But I've also bought and added to that case with modules that I bought brand new. And what I found with those modules is that still, although they are kind of calibrated, ballparkish, they're not really very accurate either, and they need calibrating as well. So yes, you can buy your module and it can be perfectly calibrated to start with, or you might find that you do need to calibrate it yourself. And even if it is perfectly calibrated to start off with, there's always the question as to whether it will need recalibration in the future. Now, I'm not 100% sure why this is. I'm not a physicist. I'm not an electronics engineer. Now, I know that heat definitely plays an important part in the tuning and the accuracy of an oscillator such as this one, which is why you need to really give them plenty of time to warm up, and you're hoping that it's been designed in a way that will reach a sort of like a stability level after a certain period of time, and the tuning will stay stable at that point. But forgetting about temperature variations, actually over a period of time, weeks, months, years, a perfectly calibrated module such as this one will end up needing recalibration at some point in the future. Now, I don't know exactly why this is, but I'm assuming there's some kind of wear and tear that goes on inside these electronic components. And Maybe the quality of the components plays an important role here as to how often you're going to need to recalibrate your modules. Cheaper components may well wear more quickly than more expensive components. I don't know. Please leave a comment if you can help me out on this part. But even though you might end up with either buying a perfectly calibrated module or perfectly calibrating yourself, or getting someone else to help you to calibrate it, you still have the situation that at some point in the future you're going to need to recalibrate it. So calibration ends up being a really important part of using 100% analog oscillator modules and filter modules like this one here. So the question then is, well, what about other synthesizers? Forget about Eurorack, for example. What about my Prophet 6 that I've got here behind me, or two of them, in fact? They've got voltage control oscillators inside them. I don't need to take the case apart and get out a screwdriver and fiddle around with them. And I don't have to do that with these because they have software, firmware inside them that is constantly attempting to compensate for the fact that the oscillators themselves are out of tune at different temperatures, and will go out of tune over a period of time. There's software that's constantly, like at runtime, if you like, sort of like in real time, adjusting the voltages that reach those oscillators in order for them to constantly sound in tune. So with synthesizers like this, using firmware and software, we're kind of cheating in a way. You don't need to open it up and use a little screwdriver and recalibrate it. The software is kind of compensating for you. But with really sort of bare bones modules like this, there is no firmware, there is no software compensating. And with a module like this, you wouldn't want it because you've bought a copy of a vintage circuit design. So you want, that real perfection and imperfection that a vintage circuit gives you. There is no firmware compensating. You're going to have to end up getting out a screwdriver and playing around with these pots on the back here. So what is involved with a calibration of a module like this? Now, why am I saying you might need to be an electronics engineer? Is that just clickbait? Well, not quite. You don't need to actually get out a soldering iron and replace any of the components on here, not at all. But let me just take you through just a few of the steps that are written down in the quick start, the quick start guide for this particular module. The kind of things you're going to have to get involved with. If I look at a shot on the screen for you, step 4. We're going to step 4 here. Fine tune the 921B's oscillator's low frequency scaling via the following steps. Step A, make sure the frequency control knob remains at 0 throughout this procedure. Well, that's fair enough. Anyone can do that. Step B, apply exactly -2 volts to the 921AB link frequency input jack. -2 volts. Where do I get that from? In brackets, a 921A module can be used to supply the -2 volts or use a similar low impedance stable voltage source. Now I've got a 921A module. I'm wondering, does it emit -2 volts? Just handily for me? Does it do that? I don't know. I've looked at the documentation for the 921A module and it doesn't say it emits -2 volts. I'm going to have to get out a multimeter, a voltmeter, and actually see what it's generating. Or could I just use it and somehow, turn the tuning dials on it to get my -2 volts? I don't know. I'm going to have to investigate that. So here, yeah, you don't need to be an electronics engineer, but you need to start mucking about with multimeters And if you don't happen to have a 921A module, which you really do need if you're going to use one of these 921Bs, but if you don't have a 921A module, you're going to need to get your hands on a similar low impedance stable voltage source, which means you really need to know what you're doing kind of thing, I think. Let me just look at another of the steps here. Step 5. Step 5? No, sorry. We're still actually doing step 4. But we're on step C, 4C. Trim the scale trimmeter to set 160 Hz. Then remove the -2 volt input and readjust the frequency adjust trimmer to 640 Hz. So you're going to need a way of reading the frequencies that this thing generates. And now, I have a tuner, I have a few tuners. I've got little hand tuners that I use. I've also got a plug-in on my door, which is a tuner as well, a digital tuner. They're accurate enough to get things in tune, but are they accurate enough to calibrate this module with? Let's look at step 5. Step 5B. Trim the high adjust trimmer to set the 921B sawtooth output to exactly 20.48 kilohertz. That's what it says. That's what I have to do in the instructions here. 20.48 kilohertz. I don't have a tuner that gives me 2 decimal places of accuracy. And I don't know whether I actually could turn these things around to get that amount of accuracy anyway. It sounds like there's a certain amount of accuracy there that you really would benefit from having some decent gear, some decent lab equipment to call upon to be able to measure exactly 20.48 kilohertz. So in terms of measuring frequencies, in terms of supplying voltages and making sure those voltages are exactly -2, exactly +5, etc., 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 those things that you're going to have to do to calibrate this module, it would help a lot if you're an electronics engineer. Certainly you're going to need some decent equipment, and you're going to need to have the confidence and some experience of doing this kind of thing. Now, there will be many, many people on the internet, if you do search of oscillator calibration, that won't go into all this details about -2 volts and +5 volts and reading 20.48 kilohertz. They'll talk about a procedure where you start off with a very low note and you adjust a couple of trimmers, and then you go up to a high note, and then you adjust some trimmers and you go back down to the low note and the high note, the low note, the high note, and you iteratively get the module scaled correctly that way without having to do too much of this sort of like setting of voltages or reading of accurate frequencies. There are other ways of doing it that are less sort of technically written than these procedures that I'm reading to you here. But there's a kind of an assumption. Whoever wrote this quick start guide, there's an assumption here that whoever's going to buy this can do that stuff, has the capabilities up here to do that stuff, and has the equipment to do that stuff. And that's kind of disconcerting. And I think it's steeped in history. I think if you were to go back 10 years, who are the kind of people that are into eurorack? People who are into electronics, most likely. Who are into eurorack now? Everyone. Musicians, people that want to make music, are into eurorack now. It is incredibly popular and becoming more and more popular by the minute. And Behringer know how popular it is. They're producing sort of like recreations of vintage stuff for us all to use. You've got to bear in mind that you actually might need to calibrate these modules before you can use them. And you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and get involved in quite a lot of detail, and it may or may not be for you. So that's really all what I wanted to say in this video. It's quite a short video. It's kind of a word of warning video, I suppose. If you're going to get into eurorack and you're going to get into analog modules like this, then you really do need to sort of like understand what you might have to do in order to get them to work. Now, obviously, you don't need to tune. You don't need to calibrate these modules at all if you don't want to. You know, I can play a note, I can tune it manually on the front, and it's in tune. Maybe a few notes either side, it'll be in tune if you're lucky. If I change the octave range, okay, I retune it. You can use it without calibrating it. You could just have to keep on retuning it all the time. Or maybe you don't care if your music is not in tune. The sounds that you're creating are not in tune. Maybe that's okay as well. I mean, there are plenty of people that don't seem to be too worried about the tuning of their instruments. But if you are into the tuning of your instruments and you really want everything to be in tune and you want to use your eurorack gear to create music and be creative with, rather than having to stop all the time and retune all the time, you know, the more modules you've got, the more oscillators that you've got, the more you're flicking around and changing octave ranges, the more you're playing music that goes up and down the keyboard, the more you're going to have to tune these guys. And there might be a piece of music that does cover a sufficient range on the keyboard that will never be in tune. It might be in tune at the bottom but not at the top, or it can be in tune at the top but not at the bottom. You're going to have to get to the point of calibrating these guys, and that's the point that I've got to with my System 55 eurorack case there. I'm going to have to go through the pain of calibrating every one of these modules because as it stands they're not really very usable. But as I say, it's not just a Behringer module issue, it's actually any analog oscillator that you might buy, whether it's used or new. At some point it's going to need to be calibrated. At some point you're going to have to roll up your sleeves, get out a little tiny screwdriver and start doing some kind of process to get these things scaled correctly.